Increase your vehicle's performance and gas mileage with Lucas Fuel Treatment at O'Reilly Auto Parts. Simply add it to your tank at your next fill-up to eliminate carbon and varnish deposits. Right now, get 2 bottles of Lucas Fuel Treatment for $10. See store for details. Stop by your local O'Reilly Auto Parts store or shop online at O'ReillyAuto.com.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
From the RowPaint.com studio.
Local sports talk with Prater and the Ballgame. Every weekday at 3.
1350 AM, KTIK, Nampa, Boise. And on 95.3 FM, Sports Radio The Ticket.
A Cumulus media station.
Get in, sit down, and hang on.
It's about to get crazy. It's about to go down.
This is Idaho Sports Talk with Prater and the Ballgame.
It's about to get crazy. It's gonna be loud. This is our home. We do what we wanna. We'll blow the roof off. Everybody's coming. It's about to get crazy.
On Sports Radio 95.3 FM and 1350 AM, The Ticket. It's time for the Bronco Nation News Report with 4-time NSMA Idaho Sports Writer of the Year, BJ Rains.
Love Fridays at this time. We welcome our video audience. We welcome the audience at Bronco Nation News, your BNN report. What's going on, BJ? We weren't really sure what we were going to talk about today, and then some schedule news was released, and we thought, holy shnikes, there's going to be our 4 o'clock today. Welcome. How's it going today, BJs?
Yeah, it always seems like that when you don't know what's going on, or, it's going to be an easy day, then something pops up. So I've got a busy night tonight, so expect about 7 o'clock. They're going to announce all the conference realignment stuff right when I'm trying to spend some family time. So be ready. Be ready tonight.
The news today that Boise State hosting Houston next year in 2024, the first half of a home-and-home that ends in 25 will not take place. We still don't know about the game in 25. We don't know if the game in 24 will be made up, but what we do know, BJ, correct, is that it will not happen. Boise State now has an open non-con game next year.
Well, here's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing that the game in 25 will happen. Boise State will go to Houston, and then Boise State is looking to renegotiate this as a 2-for-1, in which Boise State will get paid to go to Houston in 2025, and then they will do a home-and-home series a couple years after that is the goal. So the goal and the expectation is that Houston still will make an appearance on the blue at some point in the next decade. But apparently BYU and Boise State used to count as, quote, Power 5 games for Big 12 teams. But once BYU went into the Big 12, they scrapped Boise State from having that count as a Power 5 game. So Houston needed to add another Power 5 game. They added Oklahoma instead, asked Boise State to, if they can work with them in moving the date. So Boise State will now just get paid for the 2025 game on the road. Essentially, that's still expected to happen. And then the hope is they can work out a home-and-home after that, where essentially becomes a 2-for-1. But Houston at some point in the 2020s, Boise State still expects them to come to the blue.
BJ, so that's the only reason, is because Houston and their new rule with the Big 12 says you got to play one Power 5 non-con opponent a year. That's the whole thing on this thing?
I don't know if it's 1 or 2 or whatever the deal was. They needed another, quote, Power 5 game. Okay. So they added Oklahoma instead, asked Boise State if they could renegotiate this and work it. And so that's how it worked out. Yeah. And now they're left with an empty game in 24, and it could be 2 games in 2024 with depending on what happens with Oregon State in terms of it being a conference game. But I'm told there's a lot of possibilities there. One is on short notice if or maybe Oregon State comes into the Mountain West and they do not play in the regular season, they could continue to play that game as a non-conference game. There's some other options in play, and I think the 2024 game for Houston is probably going to be an FCS opponent. Nobody wants to hear that, but if they have to remove Oregon State because that becomes a conference game, then I think you could maybe look at BYU popping back in there as a possibility.
Yeah, I got BYU as a possibility, period, on here, because BYU, that game, BYU plays Utah. That becomes, in next year, that becomes a conference game now in theory, although I guess you could do the same thing that they're talking about with Oregon State, just make it a non-con game. Anything is anything is possible. We learned through COVID. Remember when they were scheduling games on Monday for Saturday in COVID season? Yeah. In the past, the football schedule's got to be done 3 years in advance. Well, they did it in 5 days, so they can make it happen. They can get creative. But I would guess that the Oregon State or the Oregon game, and you reported that the Oregon game so far is okay, but something's going to happen with one of those two games. Definitely one opening. I wouldn't be surprised if there's two. I got BYU on my schedule of possibilities. How about Cal and Stanford? I mean, they're going to be looking for teams. I don't think they're going to end up in a conference next year. They're going to have to fill out a non-con. Why don't we do a home with Cal, a road trip to Stanford? I don't know, figure it out, some kind of creativity. And then I got some local regional FCS, Idaho State conversations as well, BJ.
Well, first on the Oregon front, Boise State's understanding, and who I talked to down there, is that they have been informed by Oregon / the Big Ten that there's no reason to worry about that series being moved. So as of now, and they fully expect the 3 games to go as scheduled with Oregon in 2024, 2025, and 2026. So the Big Ten scheduling folks, whatever their rules are, Oregon, at least at this point, has told Boise State they are fine continuing that series, Mike.
And I think that Oregon game, September 13th, 2025, is the most important game on Boise State's schedule. Jeremiah Dickey's trying to raise $80 million. He's targeted the football season in 2025 as the opening of that North End Zone project. And if he can't sell $70 million to the Oregon game, then that's an issue. If he doesn't have the Oregon game to sell to, then I think that becomes an even bigger issue. To me, that Oregon game in 2025 is the only game on this schedule that has to be it can't be touched, BJ.
And I don't think it will be. Like I said, things can always change. It's very flexible. But as of right now, there are no discussions on that game. And they fully expect, at least as of now, the 3 games with Oregon to go on as scheduled. I think there's some other games that down the line could be moved. The East Carolina series doesn't make a lot of sense for Boise State. That was done by previous administration. And if you look at Jeremiah Dickey's scheduling philosophy, they don't have a big recruiting base in East Carolina area. It just doesn't make sense. It wouldn't shock me if that series gets canceled altogether at some point. It just doesn't make a lot of sense if you look at what Boise State's trying to do to play that series. The Cincinnati series, my understanding is safe, but the game at Cincinnati in 29 could bump up to 27 potentially, and they could go to Cincinnati first. But they have been in contact with Cincinnati, is my understanding, and there's no reason to worry about the Cincinnati series being in jeopardy because they've moved. And I think the Washington game in 2029 is safe as well. Nobody gives up home games is the phrase I was told like that. They're not going to pay to get out of a home game. So the at Washington game in 2029 also safe. So a little bit of movement still could come, not a ton. But 2024, as you said, is we're kind of where we're looking at. And that's, barely a year away. And you could potentially have, I guess, 1, 2, or 3 openings. I still think it's crazy they're opening at Georgia Southern. That makes zero sense to me. But I think that the Oregon State game week 2, there's a lot of things you could play with that. But Mike, my understanding as I'm jumping around here is the only way BYU would come into play as a possibility for 2024 is if it's replacing Oregon State. If Oregon State is still on the schedule and that game happens and the Oregon game happens as expected, you'll see an FCS opponent there in 2024.
And that's because of what Jeremiah Dickey and Andy Avalos want in terms of their scheduling philosophy?
Yep. Yeah. They the original schedule, the original idea was 1 Power 5, 1 Group of 5, BYU, and then 1 FCS opponent. Now that BYU is gone, that has obviously changed things a little bit. But you look at the first year of the playoff, 2024, I mean, do they really need to be playing Oregon State at Oregon and Houston? If they're trying to get into a 12-team playoff, that's just too hard, just not necessary. And so it worked out well. If the fact that Houston, would they have loved to have them come to the Blue? Sure. But if you're already playing Oregon State and at Oregon, you don't need to also add BYU to that if you're trying to get into a 12-team playoff. It just doesn't make sense. Fans don't want to hear it. But if you're trying to put yourself in the best position to be that top-ranked Group of 5 team or whatever you want to phrase it for 2024, playing Oregon State and Oregon and then another Big 12 team in BYU just doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think Houston will be replaced by an FCS school unless, like I said, you lose Oregon State and then potentially BYU becomes an option. But I think they just want to they're going to have an FCS opponent in there probably every year now moving forward. You have Eastern Washington in 2025. And if you look just down the line, I think that's going to be the one way they're going to do it. They're going to have a solid Group of 5 team. They're going to have, but I know fans don't want to hear it, but there's really no reason to play 4 really tough non-conference games if you're trying to be that top team. So I think an FCS home game is going to happen pretty much every year.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense during the 24 and 25 seasons when they're going to be in play for the CFP, 26 and on, when they may not have any access to a college football playoff. That scheduling philosophy may change. They may have a 2-year window, and you're 1,000% right, BJ. You have to capitalize on that 2-year window. Based on everything you said, and it makes a lot of sense to me, they have to plug in Idaho State in 2024. Next year, just plug in Idaho State. They have an opening on their schedule. They confirmed it with their athletic department, and they can make that happen. Why wouldn't you bring Cody Hawkins over here for a game?
Makes perfect sense. Yeah, they already have 2 road games in the non-conference at Oregon State, at North Dakota in 24 in terms of Idaho State, but that's okay. They'd drive over on a bus and take the paycheck. I certainly think that is possible. Everyone wants to talk about Idaho. They don't have an opening until 2026, I believe, at the earliest. So, Idaho State, in-state school. I even looked, somebody mentioned on what about UC Davis bringing over Dan Hawkins. I looked them up. They don't have any openings for a couple years either. So, they have an opening. It's an easy trip. It's an in-state school, and it seems like it could be done with one quick phone call. I think Idaho State makes a lot of sense for next year.
Yeah, and I'm not even with the phone call. I don't even know if you have to juggle the schedule, because as you said, they have 2 road games already, but Idaho next year has 3 road games. They play at Oregon, they play at Wyoming, they play at Abilene Christian.
Yeah.
So if Idaho's playing 3 road games and then 1 non-con home game, Idaho State certainly can do the same thing, especially if that means a paycheck from Boise State.
Yeah, the only problem is their opening is on September 7th for Idaho State, and that's currently the date of the Oregon State game for Boise State. So you'd have to move around some dates there potentially. But it's pretty easy to find an FCS opponent that's willing to take that small check and come down, and that makes a lot of sense if they can work out the date.
We all think, again, BJ Rain's with us. It's our BNN report on Fridays. We all assume, or we think there'd be a good chance if Idaho ever does come to the Blue, that it would be at least close to a sellout. I would have expected next year's home game versus Houston from the Big 12 would have been a sellout. Major opportunity there. I mean, does Idaho State, you're probably not going to draw what you draw from Houston, but does it even kill another bird with the same stone? If you do schedule in Idaho State, because you're going to get a better attendance number than you typically would if it was whatever other school outside of maybe Idaho, BJ?
Well, I'll just be honest with you. Look at September 21st of next year.
Yeah.
Boise State has an opening on the schedule, and Idaho's supposed to play at Abilene Christian. I don't know all the details there, what that would cost to get out of, but I don't think it's even crazy to think that the 21st of next year, Idaho doesn't go to Abilene Christian. They instead come to the Blue. Is it going to happen? Probably not. I will say this. I don't think there is some, directive coming down from Dr. Trump where they cannot schedule Idaho, or that Jeremiah Dickey doesn't want to schedule Idaho. I think they believe it would be a sellout. It would be a game people want to see. And frankly, I think they would feel pretty good if you're Boise State. We'll just pay you come down to the Blue, and that would be that. And so I think if it works out in the schedule in the next 3, 4, 5 years, I think there is growing momentum to potentially get Idaho on the schedule, because again, that fits Jeremiah Dickey's scheduling philosophy. They want to play an FCS school. I think, and maybe this again, as Mike said, who knows how the conference stuff's going to shake down, but I think whenever the openings start, it should just be alternating Idaho and Idaho State every year coming to the Blue for the FCS game. I think that makes the most sense. You help your in-state schools. Idaho every other year on the Blue. The other year it's Idaho State. I don't know what the chances are of that happening, but I'm not ruling out Idaho. I'm like I said, I don't know what the chances are of Abilene Christian and getting out of that game for next year. Maybe that's too hard to do, but in 2026, 2027, when they have some openings, if it works in the schedule, I don't think Boise State is opposed to playing Idaho.
I would agree with that, and we've all confirmed that, or at least I know you have. I know I have with Boise State. I don't think they're actively talking, but there's no roadblocks or barriers or directive from the top not to play them. So the path and the avenue is there. But don't forget, Idaho does have its own scheduling philosophy. Jason Eck is very, very adamant about trying to get into the playoffs, and he's not going to want to play next year Oregon, Wyoming, and Boise State. So I don't think that Abilene Christian game, he needs that. That's why he's playing the Albanese, the Abilene Christians, the Lamars, because he needs those non-con wins to help with the playoff resume. That's his priority. And then, as you said, 2025, Eastern Washington's already on the schedule. I think 26 and 27, there's a possibility to get the Vandals. But by then, if Idaho or if Boise State, again, if the G5 doesn't have access to a CFP, then I think that the scheduling philosophy has to be completely blown up, and I don't ever want to see an FCS opponent on the schedule, period.
Yeah.
The FCS opponent is to help them get into the CFP. If the CFP isn't there, start playing games that your fan base wants. The fan base under Jeremiah Dickey has taken a beating and losing big games. The Michigan States, the Houston, there's another one.
Florida State.
Yeah, Florida State, exactly. Although that's not quite his fault, but the fan base is taking a beating, and they don't like these FCS games, especially when it comes to the Georgia Southern's not FCS, but Eastern Washington. So he's going to have to rethink that policy if indeed the rules of college football change over the next couple of years.
Well, he's already going to have to rethink it because part of his deal included BYU, and that's not an option anymore. And so you could maybe weigh the FCS opponent because you're playing a Power 5 plus BYU, which was essentially 2 Power 5s every non-conference season. So now that they're having to replace BYU, that makes it a lot tougher. And yeah, I think the FCS schedule made some sense under the current format of the playoff, but if that changes, we'll have to see what happens. But I think Idaho is certainly an option at some point. There's not something that they won't plan, but it just has to work in the schedule. And I do think how this shakes out, my understanding is as soon as it's figured out with Oregon State, like if they announce tonight or whatever that they're joining the Mountain West, they would be able to figure out pretty quickly what's going to happen with the non-conference game, whether it becomes a conference game or whether they play it as a non-conference game. It just depends, and that would, I think, open up some things. Like I said, I think BYU remains a possibility for 2024, but only if Oregon State game comes off because it becomes a conference game.
BJ, I know we all love Jeremiah Dickey. The fan base does. Can I put some blame here? Can I throw some shade? Is this Jeremiah Dickey's biggest downfall since becoming the AD, losing Michigan State, Florida State, BYU, now Houston, big non-con opponents on the blue that aren't happening anymore?
The only one you can blame him for right now is Michigan State, because Michigan State was a game that he went out of his way to cancel, to take the paycheck to go to Washington and to ease up the schedule. That was supposed to be the game last year. If you remember, the UT Martin home game last year was supposed to be Michigan State. So that was making last year's schedule easier by taking off Michigan State, adding in UT Martin. The Florida State game was a, quote, act of God. Florida State was able to get out of the contract. It is what it is. Houston, same thing. They had to get out of the deal because of the Big 12 deal. That was not a Jeremiah Dickey thing. And Jeremiah Dickey, my understanding is only, the negotiating of, there's a contract still in place. And so the negotiating of that is going to include them still having to come to the blue at some point. So, it stinks. It's 3, marquee games. But the only one that I really think that Jeremiah Dickey had any say in is the Michigan State one, which he went out of his way, obviously, to do.
Hey, Mr. Vegas, our next segment, we're going to ditch you here in a second, but I'd like to get your opinion, with the Pac-12 very much dying. And we know that their impact in Vegas with the championship game for football, the championship tournament for basketball, and who knows what else they got going on there. There might be some opportunities. And this came up during Mountain West Media Days when Gloria Navarez was asked, and I know you've been all over this story in terms of, can they go down there and play their Mountain West football championship game in Vegas? She said it's on the radar, but it's probably not a priority. I don't know if this changes anything. Do you see any kind of opportunity for the Mountain West to go into Vegas and, kind of take over some of these Pac-12 spots that they're going to probably lose?
No doubt about it. I mean, I know obviously a neutral site game allows you to sell tickets all year, not just 1 week in advance. But again, you only maybe know who's in the game 1 week in advance, which makes it very tough on short notice for fans to travel to. But again, it's not like they're selling out Albertson Stadium and some of these stadiums for the Mountain West Championship games anyway. If you have a chance to have it in a marquee venue like the Allegiant Stadium down there on I think, and maybe take over the Friday night Pac-12 time slot too. I think that could maybe make some sense for the league moving forward. I definitely wonder what will happen with basketball. Do they keep that at Thomas and Mack, or do they try to take over T-Mobile Arena where the Pac-12 was, or a different venue there if that gets shifted around? Because I know the coaches love it in Vegas, but they don't necessarily love it that it's UNLV's home floor as much as they try to make it as neutral as possible. So you wonder if moving the basketball arena to a different, or basketball tournament to a different venue down there becomes an option. I'd be for the neutral site football game. I think TV would probably be for it. It would certainly be a bigger stage for the game, but in terms of what that does to the ticket sales and things, it obviously probably wouldn't help.
Any momentum, and I know it's been talked about, or at least asked, about a Vegas Bowl light. I mean, the Vegas Bowl, I think, is what, Big Ten, SEC, ACC rotation thing. So it's big-time Power 5 football right now. But like the old days with the Holiday Bowl, the Poinsettia Bowl, is there a possibility, as the bowl structure is going to take a massive beating over the next couple of years, especially here in the West, any chance for a Vegas Bowl light?
I think so, and I think there's been some rumblings about the potential. I mean, they could have 3 or 4 bowl games in Vegas if they wanted to. I mean, it's certainly is doable with, and it's just an attractive place for fans for want to go. They got close to sellout crowds every time Boise State was in that Vegas Bowl. There in a much smaller stadium, obviously, before. But yeah, I think that's definitely possible. They have, currently it used to be on the first day of the bowls, and then you could have one, closer to New Year's as well, and have a 2-week break to be able to move that around. I certainly think that's possible. And as we've all talked about, other than the LA Bowl, the Mountain West just has an atrocious bowl lineup. So they've got to find a way to have a nice second or third option for the Mountain West. And if you could get a second game going in Vegas, I think that'd be great for the Mountain West.
Enjoy your weekend. Great hit today, BJ. Good stuff.
Appreciate you guys. Take care.
It's the Bronco Nation News Report Fridays on Prater and the Ball Game. Our video segment is always sponsored by the Dollar Loan Center, funding loans for 25 years at don'tbebroke.com. Inexpensive, safe, and regulated. Apply online for a $5,000 credit at don'tbebroke.com. Prater, let's get back to Las Vegas. We talked a little bit about it right there. And would you guys want a secondary bowl in Las Vegas outside of the Vegas Bowl that doesn't include the Mountain West anymore?
By the way, do you know where the Dollar Loan Center is?
Dollar Loan Center. No.
It's in Vegas.
Okay. Awesome, man.
It's a brand new arena in Vegas where the Golden Knights have their AAA, their AHL hockey team, and where the Big West plays its basketball tournament.
Okay.
The Dollar Loan Center. And they're sponsored right here of Idaho Sports Talk.
Where is it?
In Henderson, out by Green Valley Ranch.
Okay. Love it, man. Good stuff. That's why you listen to Idaho Sports Talk. You love those facts. Prater in the Ball Game. KTIK, the ticket.